Greetings, my name is Aida Praina binti Ismail, and today me and my groupmates would like to present our topic on nonverbal communication. Now, what is nonverbal communication? Well, basically, it can be defined as a system that includes features that tend to be used together in order to support an expression. But what does it do exactly? Well, there are three primary functions. Firstly, that it acts as a way to complement verbal communication. Next would be that it may act as a form of substitution for said verbal communication. And lastly, it can also be used for a person to express contradicting feelings regarding a subject matter. Now, under the umbrella of nonverbal communication, there are four types: kinesics, object language, environmental language, and paralanguage. Now, kinesics can be defined as one's body language. Things such as facial expressions, gestures, and even the eye movements. Now, in the case of object language, it's basically the display of material things, be it consciously or unconsciously, and basically encompasses a person's physical appearance. Now, in the case of environmental language, it's basically the message of space and time. So things such as proxemics, seating arrangements, and so on. In the case of paralanguage is basically a set of audible sounds that usually accompany with oral language, be it consciously or unconsciously. It actually involves things such as volume, pitch, and even intonation. Now, different cultures have different perceptions when it comes to gestures. For example, in the case of crossing one's legs, Malaysians may see it as an act of a person being casual and relaxed. However, the same could not be said if you were from an Arabic culture, as in the Arabic culture, doing so might be seen as quite rude, especially when in the presence of someone who is much older than you. Now, what's the reason for this difference in perception? Well, one explanation is actually culture. Now, there are two types of cultures. There's high context culture and low context culture. High context culture basically states that the individuals from certain culture would have a higher emphasis on how a certain thing is said in contrast to what the person actually said. Now, the cultures that fall under this umbrella would basically be the Asian culture as a whole. Now, in the context of low context cultures, which references that of Americans and European culture, they actually place a larger emphasis in terms of the actual words that the person uses in contrast to its actual intended meaning. Now, another explanation could actually be personality differences. In the case of those from high context cultures, based on a previous study, it was found that they were more associated with that of agreeableness. As such, they are more indirect and implicit in terms of how they communicate. And as a whole, they would have a higher preference in terms of nonverbal communication. Now, in contrast to that, those from low context cultures were found to be associated with openness, and therefore they were more verbal, direct, and explicit in terms of their communication. With that being said, to wrap up this section, there are four general types of nonverbal communication, and factors such as a person's cultural background and personality differences play a large role in terms of their perception on nonverbal communication. Okay, so now we will move on to the next section handled by my group mates.
Hi, my name is Hannah, and I'll be presenting my part of nonverbal communication in the business setting. So I'll be starting off with a little comparison between the Asian and Western nonverbal communication styles in the business context. Starting off in terms of emotional expression, Asians are notably more reserved in this, as they have the concept of quote-unquote saving face. So an over-display of emotion in Asian culture is generally frowned upon because for them it causes conflict and disrupts harmony in relationships. Whereas in Western culture, on the other hand, highly value the expression of emotion because they see it as a very good way to gain insight to another person's inner thoughts. Next is the language of silence. in which this is highly preferred by Asian cultures as it indicates politeness and contemplation, whereas in Western cultures, silence is perceived as very uncomfortable, since they lean to a more extroverted nature, like the Americans, for instance. So, and also being a culture of low context, Americans also perceive silence in the conversation as rude. Lastly, but not the least, are the gesture of handshakes. So handshakes are used in greetings, conveying respect, and in terms of the business context, shaking hands on deals. But the firmness of the handshakes vary greatly in their meaning across cultures. So Asian cultures, and particularly those in the Far East, like Korea, Japan, and China, strong handshakes are perceived as aggressive. Therefore, in the Far East, bowing is the preferred alternative to handshaking. Western cultures, on the other hand, see strong handshakes as a display of one's confidence. Now I'll be talking on Malaysian nonverbal communication styles in the business setting. Starting off, Malaysian culture shares a lot of similarities with most Asian cultures, the most prominent being the concept of once again saving face. And the concept of saving face extends to the restraint of emotional expression in the business setting to maintain harmony in relationships as well as to maintain one's reputation. Next is the language of silence in Malaysian culture. Now, silence in Malaysian culture is a very useful tool. Aside from signifying politeness and respect, a pause before a response in a discussion means that a person has given an idea full contemplation and consideration. Malaysian culture is also partly influenced by the predominant Muslim population, especially in terms of interaction between the opposite sex. So, as a Muslim myself, I very much experience this. Interactions between the opposite sex should be kept respectful and modest. For example, physical touch between the opposite sex in Malaysian culture is perceived as awkward or inappropriate. So, in terms of when men and women exchange greetings, it is preferred that women give a slight bow or nod of the head as a sign of greeting. Another Islamic influence in Malaysian culture are the respective functions of hands. For instance, the left hand, for one, is considered unclean as it is used in cleaning and the removal of dirt. Therefore, one should always use their right hand in greeting, passing items, and eating as well. And last but not least is the act of smiling. Because smiling is greatly encouraged in Malaysian culture as it reflects the sunny and polite attitude that Malaysians are generally known for amongst foreigners. And with that, I end my part. I shall pass the presentation floor to my fellow groupmate. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Hello, I'm Raja Anis. Now that we've gained an understanding on what nonverbal communication is, as well as how it is applied in the business setting, we'll take a look and touch upon how it is applied in the educational setting. First off, the benefits. Let's say you're a teacher in a language center. You're trying to figure out how to better your classes and improve your sessions with your students. According to Matsumoto 2017, language classes that incorporated nonverbal communication had higher success rates in comparison to those who did not. So, by applying nonverbal communication in your classes, you'll experience higher success rates and an improvement in your sessions. In relation to that, students and teachers actually unconsciously share nonverbal cues with one another throughout the day. Therefore, teachers or educators may utilize those nonverbal cues in order to gain a deeper and in-depth understanding of their students. As previously mentioned, in addition to gaining a deeper and in-depth understanding, they will also experience successful teaching sessions. According to Bamberu and Shakpur 2017, who did a review on the impact of nonverbal communication in classroom settings, they found that educators and academic personnel's communication skills were very closely associated with a positive outcome in students' academic success and an increase in their motivation. Not only that, nonverbal communication in the educational or classroom setting encourages positive self-expression, which is useful for redirection in classrooms, whereby redirection is a strategy to provide for providing corrective feedback to students. For example, students who normally were accustomed to yelling or raising their voices to get what they want are able to then relay their wants in a calmer manner. So through constant practice of nonverbal prompts, students are able to gain an understanding of effective communication. Hence, they'll be able to apply these new skills anywhere, be it at home or in other social settings. So now we'll take a look at the types of nonverbal cues in an educational and classroom setting. So again, according to Bamberu and Shakapur, there is a strong correlation to the quality, amount, and method of nonverbal communication that educators utilize while teaching. For instance, Cohen, a special ed teacher, developed these nonverbal cues for her special ed students: verbals on and verbals off. Verbals on indicates silence, while verbals off indicates free rein to speak and they can make noise. She observed that even very vocal students worked quietly while verbals were on. She also noted that there was a shift in perspective when it came to learning, as well as a shift in getting work done. So students were able to effectively communicate their needs and want without having to yell or scream to get their message across. So different kinds of types that they have applied of nonverbal cues are things like raising hands, pointing, tapping, and writing on the board. Now, when we take a look at Asian versus Western, in the Asian classroom settings, it was found that Asians preferred expressivity when it comes to nonverbal communication, which are things like eye contact and smiling, speech expressiveness, and relaxedness, whereas in the West, they preferred kinesics, proxemics, and kinesthetics, so things like standing behind the desk, gesturing, and moving around in the class. However, it was also consensually agreed, or it's a consensus between Asians and Westerns on the kind of nonverbal communication that they liked in classrooms were smiling, eye contact, and hand gestures. So, in conclusion, while nonverbal cues vary across different cultures in an educational setting, it has been found that nonverbal communication has a positive impact on teaching or in teaching. For example, increased motivation in students and application of respectful redirection in classrooms. Furthermore, nonverbal communication applied in classroom settings encourage positive self-expression, which are applicable to not only the classroom settings, but at home and in other social settings. That is all for me. Thank you so much for watching and have a nice day.